Hi there, it's Julie Greenman, and this is our humanities class. We're going to be talking about the Greeks this year. This is an introductory presentation all about how life is a play. And if we are to know anything at all about it, our knowledge must come from a higher source by revelation. Now, the Mantic admits that the play is incomprehensible to people of as little knowledge and experience as ours, and insists for that reason that if we are to know anything at all about it, our knowledge must come from a higher source, which is through revelation. Now, who is the Mantic? Well, he is the opposite of the Sophic. Wait, stop there. Let's define and describe the Mantic and the Sophic. One of the most important subjects to discuss in a philosophy class is the Mantic and the Sophic, because you're going to see them all throughout history and all throughout time. The two, Mantic and Sophic, play out in all dispensations of time. A dispensation is a return of revelation complete with prophets, believers, and non-believers. And the most drastic stories of all time with believers and non-believers is at the time of Noah, when all the world did not believe in God, except for a meager 8 souls who did. Now, the Mantic is usually an oral tradition. They rely on God and prophets for knowledge. They provide a communal experience. For instance, everyone is needed to repeat and remember knowledge together, and they share this knowledge to the next generation and the next one. And they share all the stories and memories as an oral record of history, story, culture, and communication with God, the higher being in control. The Sophic is actually a shift away from God. It's a shift toward a more individually centered society. That knowledge is not based on God, but it's based on a scientific method where everything must be proved and seen by the physical eye and heard by the physical ear. And it leads to a written tradition. It's a standardized and replicable acquisition of knowledge. And you see this as you see the Greek writings have been handed down from generation to generation, and we still have them. And we're going to be reading many of the writings that the Sophics put together. And it doesn't mean that those are bad. It just means that the Sophics were interested in handing down written word. So the sophistic is actually an attempt to combine the Mantic with the Sophic, but ultimately you cannot combine it together. There's a scripture in the Old Testament. Joshua says that we need to choose who we're going to follow. Are we going to follow Mammon, or are we going to follow God? And Mammon is basically the Sophic. It's the one who doesn't recognize God. So a sophistic also, as they try to combine this Mantic and Sophic, they just cannot combine it together. You can't combine something that relies on God and something that doesn't rely on God but relies on scientific methods. So one theory has to give in to the other, and it usually is the Mantic giving in to the Sophic as you look through history. The scholastics were sophistic. So the scholasticism means all academics are combined together under the umbrella of religion. What's interesting about this is when the great universities began. Oxford was one of the first, and I believe it was started back in the 1200s AD, and they took all of this awesome philosophy from the Greeks and the Romans. Not much from the Romans, mostly from the Greeks. And they took out the Sophic parts of it. So the parts that didn't talk about God, they took those and they combined it with the religion of the day, which was Catholicism. And they brought all of these academics under this umbrella of religion. And so you can see that they focus much on logic. St. Thomas Aquinas fused Aristotelian philosophy into religious writing. So Aristotle, you've heard of him, and we're going to read some of him this year. He started what was called scientific. Well, it came to be known as scientific method, and at one point he says that everything can be proven by logic. Okay, and so he and many of the scholastics, which is like St. Thomas Aquinas and others, felt that science provides all knowledge. And Aristotle invented syllogisms, which is one of the most used form of logic. So this is one syllogism. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And you can see how that works, because you could see men in the first proposition and man in the second proposition. So if all men are mortal and then Socrates is a man, then you can see that Socrates is mortal because all men are mortal. Okay? And another one is a little easier to understand. No reptiles have fur, and all snakes are reptiles. You can see reptiles in both of those propositions there. Therefore, no snakes have fur. Because if reptiles don't have fur and all snakes are reptiles, then no snakes have fur. Do you see how that works in? So what's interesting is that the scholastics used these syllogisms to prove that God exists. In the Middle Ages, Anselm was a philosopher, theologian, who used a lot of syllogisms as well and proved that God can exist. And let's see. Now, with a little knowledge of what a Mantic and a Sophic is, let's get into why we need to know this. Before we get into Hugh Nibley, I want to just point out that we're going to be reading Plato, which is really Socrates' words. Socrates never wrote anything, but Plato followed him around as a student, and he wrote what Socrates taught. And Socrates actually was poisoned at the end of his life because he would not cease being a Mantic. He was actually ruining the youth, according to the Sophics, and because he was trying to bring up these ideas, these truths about life, and they finally killed him with hemlock. He poisoned him. Now, Hugh Nibley wrote a book called The Ancient, well, there's a book of his compilations, and it's called The Ancient State. And in that, there's a large essay that's called Mantic, Sophic, and the Sophistic, which is where I got most of the information for this presentation. And he had some experience with mythology as a child. His family came from Iceland and the other Slavic kingdoms, and he desired greatly to learn about his heritage. So he would read these Icelandic myths, so the mythology from Iceland. And this is what he says. And it's quite a long quote. As I'm reading, see if you can find what he's trying to say about his mythology and the difference between his mythology and the mythology of the Greeks. He says, for many years, the regular reading of the Old Norse sagas was part of a self-inflicted curriculum to which I faithfully adhered. Then one day, in the midst of a typical tale of family feuds and mayhem, I suddenly admitted to myself a proposition I had known all along, but out of loyalty to my own cultural heritage had refused to acknowledge. Let's face it, I said aloud, these people are not interesting. From that day to this, I have not read a word of Icelandic, but I have wondered why my forebears are so uninteresting. After all, their passion and their intelligence were both of a high order. Their deeds were nowhere surpassed for nobility, depravity, violence, or magnanimity. Why is it that the Greeks and Arabs, as savage and villainous and tricky as any people anywhere, continue to be so fascinating, while Scandinavians, Slavs, Armenians, and Byzantines leave us cold? I have the answer. The Greeks and Arabs always seem to be expecting something, while the others are expecting nothing. E.V. Gordon is right, he said. The heroic stamp of the Norse epic is its mood of utter hopelessness. A good resistance against overpowering odds was made the characteristic situation. The gods themselves knew that they would, in the end, be overwhelmed by the evil powers. Every religious-minded man of the heathen age believed that he existed for the sake of that hopeless cause. The Greeks and Arabs, continue Hugh Nibley, the Greeks and Arabs yield to none in their depreciation of the hopes of this life. They expect no more of this world than our Norse forebears. The difference, though, is their constant awareness, more often implied than expressed, of something beyond this world. God is the knower, says the Arab at the end of every discourse, leaving the door open for any possible subsequent developments. The Norse gods succumbed to hopelessness, Nibley tells us, and he says that the Greeks and others like them believed in something bigger than themselves, that something was God, or, as they believed, the gods, because we know that in mythology, Greek mythology, there are many, many gods. Socrates ended his life with a speech which emphasized 2 points, and we're going to read that speech. It is called Plato's Apology. And these are the 2 points that he emphasized. He said, number 1, that he had not found in this life what he was looking for, and knew of no one else who had. The second one is that failure had not in the least abated his conviction that what he was looking for was to be found. So he never claimed to have found his treasure, but he never gave up either. Never. I'm excited to be reading Plato, and we will understand a little bit more about how he taught a higher power, and that there was some mysteries to be found, but he did not have access to a fullness of the gospel, nor even the gospel that was found in the Old Testament. He lived a little after the time of Lehi leaving Jerusalem, but he lived in a different part of the world and did not have access to the Bible. Here are 2 quotes by 2 men who wrote a little bit about these Greeks, these Greek philosophers who were Mantic. Edward Mayer says, "Never on this earth have men sought," and he's talking about Plato, okay? He's talking about Socrates here. "Never on this earth have men sought with such energy and persistence to make the impossible possible in spite of everything, believing on its possibility with a bitter tenacity." I.E.S. Edwards said, "The impression made on the modern mind is that of a people searching in the dark for a key to truth, and having found not one, but many keys resembling the pattern of the lock, retaining all, lest perchance the appropriate one should be discarded. And what he's saying there is that people like Plato, and by the way, Plato is always quoting Socrates. That's why I interchange their names often. They're two different people, but because Socrates did not ever write his words and Plato did, we say it's Plato, but we know that it's actually Socrates that wrote this. But anyway, I.E.S. Edwards is saying that these were people that were searching in the dark for a key to truth. They searched and they searched and they asked questions and they pondered and they tried to figure out this higher power, this natural law that existed, always had existed. And they didn't find one of those keys, but many, many, many keys that resembled the pattern of the lock. And they retained all of them because they were afraid that if they discarded one of those truths, that they would have discarded maybe the ultimate key that would unlock all truth to them. So you can imagine, you can see this this greatness in these Greek philosophers as they were trying to find the truth to the higher, from the higher power. The principle that that will underlie all of our learning, especially this year, is that God is in heaven and reveals truth to his children. And our responsibility is that we need to recognize that God's children need to recognize the truth, and we need to believe it. And the result of that belief is that we will gain greater light and understanding of the truth, and we will continue to get more truth. Whereas the result of unbelief is the opposite. We will have lesser light, we will have darkness, and we will have deception. And the world usually does not put their trust in a higher power. They don't put their trust in God because it seems mystical and unproven to them, and it is much easier, they say, to accept what can be seen and heard physically. Boyd K. Packer, one of our apostles, said of this play that we began talking about at the beginning of this presentation, he said, "In mortality, we are like one who enters a theater just as the curtain goes up on the second act. We have missed Act 1. The production has many plots and subplots that interweave, making it difficult to figure out who relates to whom and what relates to what. Who are the heroes and who are the villains? It is further complicated because you are not just a spectator, you are a member of the cast, on stage in the middle of it all. Remember this, the line, 'and they all lived happily ever after,' is never written into the second act. That line belongs in the third act when the mysteries are solved and everything is put right." The apostle was right when he said, "If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable." And what that apostle meant, and that was Paul, was that we cannot have hope. We will be miserable if we only know of Christ in this act. We must know of him in Act 1 and Act 3 to make it all worthwhile. Boyd K. Packer continues, "Until you have a broad perspective of the eternal nature of this great drama, you won't make much sense out of the inequities in life. Some are born with so little, and others with so much. Some in poverty, with handicaps, with pain, with suffering, premature death, even of innocent children. There are the brutal and forgiving forces of nature, and the brutality of man to man. We've seen a lot of that recently." And he continues, "Do not suppose that God willfully causes that which for his own purposes he permits. When you know the plan and purpose of it all, even these things will manifest a loving Father in heaven." This is just part one of a two-part series that we're going to study the Mantic and the Sophic, because it is so essential that we understand that those two powers are working in our lives and in the lives of the ancients, that there are those who believe in a higher power, and there are those who will not believe, because God cannot be proven logically to them. And so keep in mind, we're going to be seeing a lot of this all throughout our studies, and it will be quite invigorating to find those treasures of truth as we work toward work through each work. We'll see you next time.